Do you like sports? Do you like art? What about science? Giraffes? Giraffe scientists that paint rugby games? It's all available on Audible, the biggest audiobook site with the largest selection of audiobooks this side of the inner solar system. No need to use your boring old eyes anymore. The ears are the future, my friend. Why, you're using them right now. So check out Audible and get your listen on. Go to www.readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to start your 30-day free trial today.
Wine has a genealogy just like we do and a heritage just like we do. A lot of us are starting to do DNA tests to figure out what our ancestry was like. And scientists are doing that with wine too and finding that same mix of strands and different countries and different heritages. So, I found it super interesting to just learn about wine's different stories and histories. And, wherever your heritage is from, I think you'll find there's native wine grapes somewhere near you that have an interesting story to tell.
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 40, Here Comes the Sun. As always, if you have ideas for books you'd like to see featured or of authors you want to put me in touch with, you can reach me at jon@readlearnlivepodcast.com. Today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with author Kevin Begos about his book, Tasting the Past, The Science of Flavor and the Search for the Origins of Wine. Kevin Begos writes about energy, science, wine, the environment, and everyday people. He's been a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT and was a correspondent for the Associated Press. His work has been published in a field guide for science writers, Scientific American, the New York Times, the Washington Post, MSNBC, the Christian Science Monitor, Tabler, and many other newspapers. Kevin has won awards for investigative reports and editors, Washington Monthly, the Newspaper Guild of America, Associated Press Managing Editors, and the Society of Professional Journalists. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. All right, everyone, hello and welcome to the Read, Learn, Live podcast. I am your host, John Monaster. I'm here today with Kevin Begos, author of Tasting the Past, The Science of Flavor and the Search for the Origins of Wine. Kevin, hello. Welcome to the show.
Good morning, John. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. How you doing?
Very well, thank you. How's things there?
Things are great. Brooklyn is, the sun is shining down upon us in Brooklyn, so always a good day. But we're here to talk about your awesome book, Tasting the Past. And this book was just fascinating for me. It was it's a combination, historical look at wine, travelogue about your adventures, and you got a great chance to talk to people. But I really enjoyed it. But I always like to start off with, in your own words, what was the core of the book? What's the book all about?
The core of the book, in a way, was me learning about wine. I realized how ignorant I was just from a chance encounter with some unusual grapes that kind of obsessed me and that I became obsessed with and perplexed by. And then all the way along the way, I kept on learning things. So it's really my attempt to learn more about wine.
Great. Well, I think attempt succeeded because within the book is an immense amount of knowledge in terms of the history of wine and the process of making wine and what science is bringing to that now and everything. So definitely a ton of new information there. So I always like to start off with a little bit of the creative process before we sort of delve into the book itself. So what was it like putting together this book? And I think you wrote at some point that you had published at least a piece of it as a separate article. So I don't know if that happened with others, but what was it like kind of writing and putting this all together as you were traveling?
I started out by interviewing people by phone and then reading their scholarly papers. So that was probably a full year of on and off research before I started the travels. And then
Mm-hmm.
then I spent a lot of one whole year traveling and visiting various regions. And all the way along the way, I would still be doing new interviews and visiting wineries. So but the research formed a big base for it.
Yeah, that's quite a process. It's impressive you did all of this work for a year, then you launched into the travel. I think a lot of people would have just been ready to just hit the road and get out there, but it sounds like you did your homework.
I was trying to bring the science into it, so I really needed to, get up to speed to that and read a lot of the scientific papers and a lot of books that had been, there are some scientific books about wine. Most of them are
Hmm.
just visiting vineyards, but so yeah, there was a lot of research. I enjoyed it, but that helped shape exactly where I was going to visit and the whole narrative of the book.
Yeah, so it's key. So what was the hardest part? What was one of the tougher areas that you were surprised by when you were trying to put it all together?
There was so much information,
Mm.
and the past was so there's so many interesting details about the past, not just from historical books, of course, but this new field of how science was discovering what ancient vines may have what varieties they were, what they may have tasted like. So I had to make a lot of decisions about what to leave out. That was the toughest
Ah, yeah, that is tough. That's always it's always the trick, right? That's good to know though that you left some stuff for a sequel, perhaps.
definitely left a lot of things out.
uh, yeah. So you mentioned this, but you traveled all over the world. I mean, literally, I was very impressed how far flung you got all the way to Georgia and some of these places that even I consider myself somewhat of a seasoned traveler, but I've not been there, and so that was a big decision on your part, obviously, to undertake all the time and expense and all of that of going physically to the places and meeting the people as opposed to just doing phone interviews and doing research by reading. So why did you decide that was so important, and why did you decide to kind of bring that travelogue feel into the book?
It was partly because the regions that I spent a lot of time writing about, the Caucasus Mountains and Israel and Cyprus, the Eastern Mediterranean, really hadn't been written about much from a wine perspective. Of course, there's tons of writing about Israel from other angles, and but not as much about the Caucasus Mountains or places like Cyprus or even Switzerland. So I felt like I had to see these places, not just talk to the people, but see them and feel them and get a sense of the color and just the cultures. And I don't think it would have been the same book without visiting them, although it would have been nice to just, would have been easier to just call people on the phone or chat.
Yeah, definitely. But I think that to me that helped make the book because it helps bring you to some of the places and you can start to imagine what it might have been like. And you even describe some of the um, was it like some of the caves that they found where there
Yes,
may have been some of the earliest wine that you got a chance
yes.
to learn about and see. So I think that really brought something both interesting and fun, right? Because it's fun to like imagine. This is, I think, a big draw of travel logs. It's kind of fun to imagine yourself or to imagine what it would be like at those places, especially to undertake a kind of wine tour. I think you sort of undertook the ultimate wine tour, right? That most people will never really be able to do.
Well, I think some people do it in France or Italy. I think
Hmm.
people have done great regional or country specific wine tours, but not the areas I focused on.
Yeah,
France was last on my list. No disrespect. They came about thousands of years after everybody else. So I did it
yeah. That
chronologically.
was another surprising fact I learned, which is that France is pretty late to the game when it comes to wine overall.
That surprised me too.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah. Let's get into it. I think one of the big things that you talk about in this book is all of these unusual grapes, and there was just a plethora of grapes I had never heard of, and you kind of mentioned, the most of the wine is sort of the top five, or I think it was top nine, or there was some, there's most of the grapes that people are familiar with, Merlot, Pinot Noir, and such. That's the bulk of what is found in stores today. Similar to when you think about apples, there's a couple kinds of apples you can get at the store maybe, but there's actually hundreds of varieties that could be grown. So I thought that was a very interesting story to think about, especially looking across the entire book and just finding out about new grape, new grape, new grape, and I'm just like, what? This is all blowing my mind. So maybe just to start off, how did that happen? How did we get to the point where we're at now with the way that wine is produced?
It seems to have really kicked in the late 1800s, and a couple of things happened. The French, were more and more successful in marketing, and they'd been famous for a couple of hundred years for their wine, but so had Italy and Cyprus and some other places, and even Germany and Austria. But the French became more and more famous, but then they also got hit by a huge pandemic, the phylloxera pandemic
Mm-hmm.
in the mid late 1800s. So they had to replant, and all around the world, but especially all around in Europe, vineyards were replanted with those few famous French varieties in many cases. So the old varieties had gotten killed off by the phylloxera, um, and some survived, of course, in some little areas. Um, but it was kind of a one-two punch where it was both marketing and this pandemic.
Yeah. Hmm. And going from that to kind of where we're at today, is it that the grapes that could most easily survive the phylloxera were these specific few? Is that how they ended up kind of being the chosen ones, or we're not clear?
No, because even all the famous French grapes are now grafted onto American rootstock. That's the only reason they survived. So the
Mm.
resistance was from wild American grapes. No, then a whole other thing happened after World War II, especially in the 60s and 70s with the Napa Valley and later with Australia and places like that. That was kind of pure marketing. Um, the American vineyards, California wineries realized, they were getting serious about planting wine, um, but they realized, hey, people don't know any of our names. They don't know our vineyards. So we're going to put the famous grape on the label. We're going to put Chardonnay on the label and Merlot and Cabernet.
Mm-hmm.
And the French don't do that. You don't see a bottle of a great French wine and it says Cabernet Sauvignon. It gives you the name of the vineyard.
Hmm.
Um, and of course, we had a little bit more native wine production here, but prohibition knocked a lot of it out in the 20s and 30s. So then we get into this new era, our lives, where I grew up, seeing whole row after row of Chardonnay and Merlot and Cabernet and Pinot,
Right.
occasional bottle of Syrah, something else. But for a long time, I just thought that was it, and it kind of bothered me. But it took a while for me to figure out why that was happening and that there were actually other options.
Yeah. And I think, and you talk about in the book how sort of a new generation of wine drinkers is becoming aware of that as well.
And it's just the same with slow foods or heirloom vegetables or craft beer. I think it's exactly the same interest. People just want to try different things. It's nothing against the famous varieties. It's just there's more out there.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, let's turn our clock way back because you you do this in the book wonderfully and start maybe working our way forward. But this idea of archaeobiology and um, amphoras, which were fascinating to me, both for their what amphoras were used for, in ancient times, and then how they're kind of again what we're talking. There's a resurgence, and they're being produced again today. So yeah, maybe talk about what winemaking was like in the past and archaeobiology and what that can teach us about wine.
Yeah, archaeobiology is this really fairly new field last 10 or 20 years where they're able to use things like mass spectrometers, very precise machines for the medical and scientific fields that can just find traces of like 1 part per million or billion of a chemical on an old piece of clay or an old piece of clothing. I joke in the book that it's like being able to figure out what a meal was hundreds of years ago from a little stain left on a piece of clothing.
Yeah.
And of course, it's not 100% precise, but particular foods and wines do break down into particular chemicals. Olive oil and wine are composed of different chemicals, so they break down into different chemicals. So scientists realize, hey, we can do more than just measure these old amphoras, which are all around the every ancient shipwreck in the Mediterranean is filled with amphoras.
And
But
what's
they
an
couldn't.
amphora?
That's a clay container that the Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, all the early Middle Eastern societies used to carry both wine and other liquids. They
Hmm.
would also sometimes put olive oil or pomegranate juice or things like that in it. But, up until recently, you couldn't really know anything for sure whether it was wine or olive oil or what kind of wine. And this archaeobiology lets people actually figure out whether it was a white or a red wine, a little bit about the DNA sometimes of the wine, and particularly evidence of what spices were used to flavor the wines. That's the biggest
Mm.
knowledge from archaeobiology is that ancient peoples added a lot of spices to their wine. Cinnamon, myrrh, honey sometimes, figs, various things. And there's tiny little chemical traces in some of these amphora of what the flavorings were.
Hmm. Yeah, I didn't know that. Why do you think that was, or why were they adding these spices? Was it flavor, or for preservative purposes, or?
They definitely used wine as a vehicle for medicine. So there were
Hmm.
hundreds of, uh, everything from anxiety to an upset stomach to a headache to childbirth. There would be recipes where you would add particular spices or additives to wine and just drink it that way, since they didn't really have a pharmaceutical industry other than the natural spices.
Hmm.
Um, but they clearly had a broader perception of what wine was than we. They were very willing to add things, and it may have been seasonal that they added certain fruits when they were, uh, bountiful, or maybe just when there was a big harvest, or when they could afford it. There's pretty good evidence that the kings drank uh, better wine than the common people, even thousands of years ago.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. Um, yeah. So thinking about that, I mean, so you look at winemaking, yeah, thousands of years ago. I think was it, we go back to almost 10,000 years or so in the book of
At
wine.
least at least 8,000, and probably a
Yeah.
couple thousand more.
Yeah,
Documented evidence of 8,000.
which is incredible to me. So maybe talk a little bit about how people back then made wine, and then how that's evolved over the ensuing thousands of years, to kind of where we're at today. Like, are we completely removed? Would someone from 8,000 years ago walk in and have no idea what was going on, or would they have some sense of, okay, I can understand this after a little bit?
I was really surprised to find that the Georgians, the Republic of Georgia and the Caucasus Mountains, still use basically the exact same style container today that they used 8,000 years ago. It's kind of a teardrop shape. They call them quevri, and it's kind of perfectly designed for the fermentation. Where after the fermentation, the leaves drop to the bottom to a little pointy part of the bottom, and they keep them buried in the ground, which ensures a constant temperature that it doesn't get too hot or too cold, which is also perfect for both fermentation or storing wine. So it looks like they figured out some key parts about consistency 8,000 years ago and have kept it roughly the same. Now they might have added some things, but um, still, I think someone from Georgia, if you could go back, you would see the same style amphora, at least in
Yeah.
that country. And someone from then could come here and do the same process now. And really, they also, I didn't realize that up until about 50 or 100 years ago, all wines around the world were made just using wild yeast. It wasn't any packaged or anything like that. So that's
Hmm.
just the natural yeast on the grapes that are causing the fermentation. Um, so all you really have to do is press them, get the juice out, and then let the yeast do its thing.
Yeah, sounds simple enough. Uh, yeah, so talking about yeast, you devoted a lot of time to yeast, and which is interesting because I knew nothing about yeast really. I mean, or maybe what little I did know, I realized was the tip of the iceberg. So yeah, maybe tell us a little bit about yeast exactly, and why it's so critical in terms of a lot of different parts of wine production.
Yeast is kind of like the bass player in a rock band. They're absolutely
Hmm.
crucial, but they don't get the all the stardom. And I didn't realize that yeast contribute to some of the flavors in wine. Of
Yeah.
course, they contribute the alcohol, but they've done kind of blind research tests where they use three different varieties of yeast with exactly the same unfermented grape juice and come up with three different flavors, flavor profiles.
Yeah,
So
it's wild.
the yeast are giving some of these great flavors that we fall in love with. Of course, the grapes are too, and the winemaker and all that. Um, but they're not just producing booze, which was fascinating to me. And they're also, you know, uh, seem to develop very little regional homes. They'll find a home in a winery or in a vineyard and become the local yeast variety for that area. I didn't realize there were so many hundreds or thousands of varieties of yeast.
Yeah, and you mentioned that up until 50 or 100 years ago, it was all just kind of the natural yeast. So how has that changed? How do we tame the natural yeast, and what sort of artificial yeast are we using?
Well, just like you can buy a little packet of yeast in the supermarket to make bread with, you can buy little packets of winemaking yeast. And
Hmm.
supposedly they're more geared towards styles, Riesling or Champagne or uh, Chardonnay or various things. Um, the commercial yeasts are very consistent. They've sort of bred out all the little wild, uncertainties. So the
Hmm.
commercial yeasts are designed for a big winery or a small one, but mostly a big one to get the exact same product every time. Just like, I don't want to be too harsh, but just like a loaf of, white bread at the supermarket is designed to be exactly the same every time.
Now you
You know,
can be harsh. I think we're all in agreement that that maybe isn't the best bread in the world,
yeah.
but it
Yep.
works.
Yep. So the commercial yeasts are great in terms of consistency for giving you, exactly the same profile each time. Um, and of course, a lot of winemakers like that. It helps their bottom line. It helps in the past. Some whole pressings or vintages might be ruined from bad fermentation or,
Hmm.
have at least some off flavors. So there's some good things about the commercial yeast, but the wild yeast definitely seem to give a more interesting range of flavors if you're talking about fine wine or, anything more than just like basic pleasing table wine.
Yeah,
So we've actually lost some flavors. It like anything else, it was a trade-off. You get consistency, but you lose some flavors.
that's a tough one. You know,
It is. It is.
I want to hear more about your. I'm not sure. Tell me if I'm pronouncing this wrong. Cremizan,
Parmesan.
Cremizan. This was sort of your origin story. You briefly mentioned what you're finding this wine, but it was very interesting to me. Maybe I'd love to hear that story, and then what it was like once you actually got to see it to its conclusion. Visit the winery.
Yeah, I first tasted Cremasan's wine in 2008 in an Amman, Jordan hotel room, which I hadn't expected to find any decent wine in. And I'd never heard of this winery. They're based just outside Bethlehem and actually right on the edge of Jerusalem. And when I got back to America, this was 2008, I expected to just go buy a wine or order it online. And I couldn't buy it because they had no distributor in America. And so they weren't getting reviews. Nobody back then had reviewed them. So I got kind of obsessed with them and, kept picking away and finding little bits of information. But it wasn't until 2015 that I actually got to visit them 7 years later. Um, so I'd built up this whole, uh, I don't know whether you'd call it an image or a memory in my mind of what the wine tasted like that I had tried in 2008. And there's a big question among researchers over whether we really can remember tastes. We all
Hmm.
think we can. You know, we
Sure.
we can definitely remember experiences like that was a good restaurant. That was a good wine. 2 years ago at the wedding or at the somebody's birthday party. But whether we actually remember tastes is a really pretty much more difficult question. It seems like maybe sommeliers, with all their training, do. But I was a very average wine drinker. I was just like a normal guy who'd tried some wine I really liked.
Hmm.
So anyway, I visit Cremasan in 2015. Astoundingly beautiful valley. It's a monastery built in the 1880s and one of the few still wild valleys near Jerusalem because Jerusalem has expanded and built up around it just like all other major cities in the world.
Hmm.
So this looks probably like it very similar to what it looked like 2 or 3,000 years ago, just It's high on a hill, steep olive and vineyard terraces going down for hundreds and hundreds of feet. Um, it's literally what people would have seen 2 or 3 thousand years ago. So that part was amazing to just experience that because it felt like stepping back in time.
Oh wow. Uh, and so yeah, again, you had this great experience, and then later you talked about what happened to the winery. In essence, that you had this delicious, amazing, mind blowing wine, and then turns out the person that was responsible for it passed away, and then that knowledge was kind of lost, and there were consultants brought in, and everything kind of changed, and it's
Yeah.
different now, for better or for worse, and you're never going to get what you had.
Yes. Yeah, it took me several years to figure that out. I'm not sure whether he's died or just very sick and went back
Oh,
to
okay,
Italy. Um,
okay,
um, you know, he definitely got very, very sick and had to leave and go back to Italy. And I'm not sure if he's passed away yet, but I never met him.
mm-hmm.
So a new round of winemakers came in. I think they're very good. They're doing a lot of good things, but they aren't making it the same way they were making it in
Right.
2006 or 7 or 8 when I tried it. And that's a really basic lesson that, probably any wine expert knows, but I just had to experience it myself that just because you buy a bottle from whatever your favorite winery is in 2018, it doesn't mean it's going to be the same in 2028.
Yeah.
So many things can happen, both from the harvest to the change of a winemaker or change of an owner. So the red wine wasn't what I remembered, but then now they're making a white wine that I do like very, very much. I still like their red wine now, but they've clearly changed. So they, wineries are an evolution just like our lives are an evolution.
For those of you excited about trying new wine, one of my favorite things is that the end of every chapter had kind of a list of wines from the chapter you recommended and some of the places that you could find them, especially in America. And extremely helpful for me was some New York based wine cellars that you pointed out that I could go visit. So I think that's great. So, it's another thing if you're reading the book and you're really excited and, there's very specific information like here's the website, here's the distributor, you can go get the wine. So I appreciated that very much.
Good, yeah. I felt like I just had to do it with these obscure wines because I didn't want people getting all excited and not, knowing where to go because I'd been in that situation
Right, right.
for many years with not being able to buy the Cremison wines, and I didn't want to put anybody else through that. So with
Through the
most of them,
misery. Yeah.
you can at least order them by mail.
Your comment about remembering flavor is really interesting to me. I think memory is fascinating in and of itself. I mean, our what we remember, what we don't, how we kind of recreate stuff as we remember. It's fascinating. But I know there's been a lot of work done on flavor. And you talk about it in the book and just the idea of how flavor works in the brain and um, all the research these companies are doing to think about, there's a million additives that there are a million things that can go into wine to change the flavor. Um, so yeah, maybe talk a little bit about what it's like now in terms of how the flavor research is ongoing and what we're learning about the neuroscience of flavor.
I hadn't realized there's pretty good research suggesting that the brain is kind of like a gatekeeper. In other words, we taste something, and the brain's immediately saying, "Okay, is this good for us or bad for us?" And part of that's just memory. If it's something that we enjoyed in the past, probably synapses open in the brain. The brain's like, "Okay, that's good," and it opens up, uh, some memories and maybe some increased enjoyment. And it probably goes back, hundreds of thousands or even millions of years where people had to learn what they could eat and what would poison them in the wild because of course they're poisonous plants and things that make you sick. So that may have been the origin, but now it looks like that when we repeatedly try things we develop parts of our brain. So the sommeliers, they have a good memory for what vintage is where, but apparently their brains are also building up this kind of storehouse of information, just like, a policeman would build up information, or an athlete or a baker learns things about their particular field.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so some of the scientists say, look, flavor is really happening in our brain. It's not happening in our mouth. It's what excites us. But I hadn't known either that people's taste buds vary very widely, even especially between men and women, and that makes sense. Every I think we all know that we've been to one restaurant where we love it and our friend doesn't love it.
Right.
Uh, uh, or, you think something's great and they go, eh.
Yeah, it's kind of a funny experience. It's one of those things that reminds us that not everyone is us. Like not everyone is just a copy of us, but looks a little different. Like there's literally they experience the world differently. Like their senses are oriented differently from us, and so yeah, that's a good thing to keep in mind when you're trying to convince someone of your favorites.
And that's companies have all and winemakers have learned what kind of the risk-free medium is. To make
Mm.
just slightly citrusy, maybe a little bit of fruit flavor, light, white or red wine, or a fruity red wine, red or white wine. So there's also that middle of the road, which I guess is the equivalent of kind of fast food that's meant to appeal to as many people as possible.
Yeah, that Goldilocks zone. Yeah, and it's a little bit maybe it's a little sad. I mean, I forget if I think this was in the book when you talked about the idea of, or someone you were speaking with mentioned the idea of it being like pop wine,
Yes,
kind of like a pop song,
yes,
where it's designed to appeal to a large segment of the population, whereas there are specific wines that are designed to appeal to very narrow tastes. And yeah, I mean, it got me thinking of it kind of in that metaphorical way where it's like, okay, maybe if you find a band you really like, you should follow them because maybe they'll put out new songs that you are going to like. And it's the same if you find a winery or a grape or a region that you're into, pay attention. And it's likely things will continue being somewhat similar. I mean, like you said, things, of course, could drastically change or,
yeah,
things can always change. But especially if it's a region or a grape, at least the underlying foundation
yes,
seems like we'll be there.
yes.
So that's maybe one good way to think about it. Um, One of the other things I really loved about your book was all the people you talked to. And you talked to a huge range of people. You talked to scientists that were spending their whole career doing nothing but wine related work. You talked to obviously a lot of wine producers. You talked to historians. You talked to just such an interesting group of people. And it kind of it made wine personal to me. I mean, I think a lot of times our experience with wine is very much, we walk into the store because that night we need wine and we see some bottles and maybe we ask someone for help if it's a nice store. Otherwise, we just look at them and make some guesses.
Yes,
I have a little app on my phone where I can take a photo of the label and it tells me some things. Maybe people are doing that.
yes.
But generally it's not we're not connected,
Right.
and I think this you did a great job in the book of connecting us. So I wanted to know if you had any favorite personalities you spoke with or anyone in particular that was of interest.
I really enjoyed Father Gerasim at Aliberti Monastery and Winery in the Caucasus. That was just a very unusual experience, meeting basically an Orthodox monk, an Orthodox Christian monk,
Mm-hmm.
who totally views the wine as, both a spiritual and community thing. I mean, to him, it's completely tied with his religion and, you know, you know, rituals in Christianity and even before that, but also completely tied to the rituals in his own country, which go back thousands of years. So that was really like stepping back in time. He was a tremendous man and a fine winemaker too. Um, and then, I think like in a lot of other fields, there are a number of women around the world making really interesting wine and maybe bringing some sensibilities that I don't want to say men haven't had, but um, Ariana Acapinti in Sicily, and then Deirdre Heekin in Vermont, who I just spoke to on the phone, but have tried her wines. So there are quite a number of women around the world who are starting to sort of change the male-dominated winemaking field.
Yeah, it's a good thing. Uh, so I'm sure at this point, everyone listening to this that likes wine is extremely confused that we haven't talked about one of the main aspects that everyone always mentions when you talk about wine, which is this concept of terroir.
Hmm.
which I almost never feel like I pronounced right either. It's terroir, terroir. Is it like it's a WA sound at the
Well,
end?
that we would have to ask the French, get a
Yeah,
native French speaker, and probably different regions say it slightly differently. I always say
yeah,
terroir, but
terroir. Okay.
my French isn't perfect, so.
Yeah, my French is non-existent, so we'll go with terroir. Uh, but that's sort of a key thing in many people's minds, anyway. I mean, so I'm curious to know whether what is it? I mean, first off, because I feel like it's kind of used and abused and thrown about a lot in marketing, and and what couldn't we learn from that? Like, what's changing about it? What are winemakers doing to what are different ways of, I guess, using that when you're producing wine?
Well, the one thing we know is what terroir isn't, and it is not the grapevines taking minerals up from the soil and putting that same minerally flavor into the wine. And that's
Mm-hmm.
the old story, and it's an appealing story. It sounds great, and I'm sympathetic because sommeliers or wine retailers, they have like 15 or 30 seconds to you know
To pitch, yeah.
yeah, to pitch something. People are eating, they're buying, they're rushing around. So it just sounds very cool that flavors would come up from the limestone or the flint, and then you get that flavor in your bottle. It just doesn't happen that way, period. End of story. Sorry to ruin the myth.
Mm.
But the fascinating thing to me is that there are those flavors in the wine, and they do vary by region, and sometimes one hillside will be different from another hillside. And the latest research, again, it suggests that sometimes those humble, lowly yeasts are actually contributing minerally flavors to wine, like a
Mm.
kind of flinty gunstock flavor seems to come from yeast. But in other situations, it has to do with the whole diversity of the vineyard, even the microbes down in the soil, and what's happening down in the roots, and of course the skill of the winemaker too. So it is incredibly fairly rare. I mean, nobody's figured out how to reproduce terroir on a consistent scale. I
Mm.
think if anybody had, they would be incredibly rich. Um, so it's still a very elusive, ephemeral thing, and all science can say is there are probably dozens of different inputs, from the microbes in the soil to the yeast to the grape variety to the rainfall that year to the
Mm-hmm.
insects in the vineyard, all sorts of things.
Hmm. I mean, it seems like at some point it would lend itself towards understanding, right? Like if we measured everything possible that we could measure, and then did that year over year, and then found, there was one year that a particular Bordeaux vintage was amazing, and we had measurements for every single, including the rainfall. Wouldn't it be possible somehow to replicate all of that?
Some people think so, but I'm skeptical, and the reason I'm skeptical is because some of these flavors we love evolve over time in the bottle. So it's not
Mm,
just what happened at bottling, but how it tastes 5 or 7 or 10 years
I
later.
see.
And the one thing scientists sometimes don't really admit that they're not good. Science is really great at finding one particular piece of information, like right now, like what's the DNA, what's the flavor compound. Once there's like dozens of different inputs, then you get into environmental science, which you have so many variables that theoretically what you're saying is possible. You could, with a supercomputer, monitor everything in the soil and the grape and the vinification and the aging in the bottle. But when you get all those variables, it's just that's why every vintage is different on a great wine.
Yeah, it actually reminds me. So totally separately, I'm reading this book, or I'm listening to this audiobook called The Big Picture, and what I'm learning about now is something called emergence, and the idea sometimes that kind of a macroscopic big thing can come out of something microscopic pieces, and it's more than its parts.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, he's talking about like consciousness and sort of epic things like that, but it sounds kind of similar. And it's like there's all these little constituent parts, but they come together to make something that's you can't just add them all up. It's more than that.
Exactly. I think that's very true for wine. For anyway, these fine wines that have multi-dimensional characters. So terroir, it certainly has something to do with the soil, in terms of that contributes to how healthy the vines are and how much water they intake and all that kind of thing, but they don't get that minerally flavor directly from the rocks. I tell people, it doesn't have to burst the whole myth. I think it's kind of cooler to say, okay, there's this great thing called terroir. Some wines exhibit this mysterious minerally flavor, and we don't know exactly why. I think
Right. Yeah, that's great. There's
so.
still some mystery left in the
There's
world. I
there's
think it's a
still
good
some,
thing.
the world's leading scientists don't know exactly why.
Yeah. No, I think that's key. I always remember that. I don't know if you've seen the movie The Truman Show, but I always remember that scene when Truman he's in school and says he wants to be an explorer, and his teacher just pulls the map down and is like, "No, I'm sorry that the world's been explored already." Trying to quash that. No need. We've already got it.
Yeah.
So always good to know there's more mystery out there for solving. So yeah, let's bring it on. We've talked about the whole world here. Let's bring it home to America, because you at the end of the book you sort of come back to America and you travel around a bit and get to know a little bit more about what's happening here in terms of wine production. And I'm especially curious to know more about the couple you talked about in Portland, I believe, that kind of started using these amphoras and then started a whole separate business with them.
Yes. Andrew and I was completely astonished to find an amphora manufacturer in Oregon, um, and I haven't visited them yet. I've only spoken to them on the phone. But
Mm-hmm.
Andrew Beckham is, a lifelong potter. He teaches pottery in a local high school. He's been a serious potter for 15 or 20 years. Um, and he realized a few years ago, at the suggestion of his wife, who is a wine lover, that hey, people are reintroducing these amphora in Italy and other places. So he started trying to make them. He thought, hey, I can do that,
Mm-hmm.
which most of us could not do it because there's very specific firing, for a clay vessel that holds liquid, and a lot of liquid. It's got to be both strong enough to hold the liquid, but also fired correctly so it all doesn't just seep out through the porous clay. So
Mm-hmm.
he did some experiments and he's figured out how to make amphora. And they also have a small vineyard where they're making their own wines. And that's just amazing to me that you can buy now amphora made wine made here in America.
Yeah, and not only that, he's started this huge business of selling amphora to other wineries.
Yes.
So and you can buy them, very very large ones. It sounds like, to do large scale production.
Yep. He makes them in all sizes, both large scale production and small ones. And to me, it was an interesting story twist because even with all the science, and there are a lot of wineries just totally embracing the science and additives and various things, there's also a big push all around the world to go back to these old traditions. Um,
Mm-hmm.
because the kind of core of the old traditions is that you can still make great wine just with grapes, natural grapes, no additives, even in a clay container, you can still make great wine. Um, and in a way, most of the wines I drink now are made more in this old-fashioned style of unfiltered, no additives. Um, and so, even with all the science and all the technology, some people are just going back to the basics, which is kind of the same as making your bread with wild yeast or um, eating the local fruits or vegetables or whatever.
Sure. Yeah, and that's a great lead into my next question. I mean, it seemed to me like a big theme in the book was kind of not forgetting our past and thinking about history when we're doing winemaking. And you talked in the book about how there is conflict between people when the corporations come in and want and just pay vineyards off so that they tear up all their old vines and plant whatever new stuff they want. And so there's a lot of this kind of tension, it seems like, in the industry. So what do you think are some ways we can kind of hold on and respect our past while still kind of making way for the innovation and the future of wine? I mean, is that an impossible task, or is there light at the end of the tunnel?
I don't think it's impossible. I mean, to me, I think diversity, just basic diversity answers a lot of the issues. And diversity is, planting or trying wines from various native grapes, not just those five or six famous ones, because As one wine scientist said to me, every wine grape kind of has a natural niche somewhere in the world. The Greek grapevines have their niches. The Swiss grapevines are very different up in the mountains. So we're starting to move into and discover that. And the same thing with wild geese. Is if you just experiment a little bit, you can end up with really unique wines just by letting nature take its course. But on the other hand, there's no question that people can benefit by having, doesn't have to be strong refrigeration, but just keeping wine at a proper temperature, or
Hmm.
keeping the vineyard clean. Or some people ferment in the amphora, but then of course it goes into glass bottles with corks or even synthetic corks. So there's room for mixing. It doesn't have to be all old fashioned or all new.
Hmm. Okay, I like that. Some hope. And the last part you talk about the future, and I was super surprised to find some of this stuff out, like the idea of synthetic wine is obviously a bit bizarre, but I had also heard of I guess the efforts to grow meat, in like little in
Yeah.
I don't know what the right term is, but basically to grow meat without animals,
Yes.
just to grow the meat cells.
Yeah.
So it seems somewhat similar. So yeah, I guess what's the future? How do you think all these new players like the synthetic wine or people making sort of wine-like products but not with grapes? I mean, where are all these little niches going to end up?
So far nobody's really been successful with that. They've gotten a lot of press, but um, I think the problem is, or maybe the good thing is that you can make good wine still fairly cheaply. Um,
Mm,
you know, it's hard to get great wine at $5 a bottle, but at $15 a bottle you can. So these synthetic wines so far tend to be even more expensive. So
ah,
I don't know if they're going to be able to compete, although probably prices will keep coming down. And people seem to, like the uniqueness of wine. If there was a synthetic French fry, well, maybe people would flock to a synthetic French fry, um, uh, or a meat alternative. But
yeah.
I'm not sure what the synthetic wines, how attractive they're really going to be to anybody. Other than unless they can make them super super cheaply.
Yeah. Yeah. Huh. All right. Well, yeah, let's wrap it up. I mean, we've talked about a lot today. We've covered a ton of stuff. I mean, there's obviously much more in the book. Are there any big ideas or concepts or things to take away that you hope people will get that we haven't had a chance to talk about?
Wine has a genealogy just like we do, and a heritage just like we do. A lot of us are starting to do DNA tests to figure out what our ancestry was like. And scientists are doing that with wine too, and finding that same mix of strands and different countries and different heritages. So, I found it super interesting to just learn about wines, different stories and histories. And, wherever your heritage is from, I think you'll find there's native wine grapes somewhere near you that have an interesting story to tell.
Yeah, I agree. So no pressure, but you finished this now. What's next? Do you have any big plans, or are you just kind of be just resting and waiting for those royalty checks to
I'm
start
looking
coming
at
in?
I'm looking at some other things, but as I said, I do a lot of research before I start a book, so I haven't decided what the next book is yet. Um,
Okay,
People are making all sorts of suggestions and saying, "Why don't you do this? Why don't you do
of
that?" But
course.
it has to be something that I really am kind of obsessed with for it to be, you know, work for me as a book.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it's a funny thing, right? When you start doing something creative, sort of everyone else pushes what they want onto you, but they're never the ones doing the work. So
Yes, yes.
good for you to resist a bit there. All right. Well, I'd like to wrap it up with just a couple quick questions, a thunder round, and then we'll call it a day. Sound good?
Yes.
Okay. So I ask everyone this, although I have a sense of what your answer may be, but I ask everyone what is your favorite food and or drink?
Well, my favorite drink is definitely wine now. But my favorite food, that would be really tough because I love Italian food, but I also love Asian food. I have a soft spot in my heart for French food and Cajun food. So you can see I can't decide with
So
food.
food is your answer. It's acceptable.
Uh, yeah, just yeah, good food.
Good food, best kind. And this next one is also, I think, going to be a great one since you've been all over. I mean, do you have a favorite? Where's one of your favorite places you've ever been?
Well, the Republic of Georgia was really beautiful, but it reminded me a little of northern Afghanistan. And I wasn't in
Mm,
Afghanistan during a great time, but the mountains of northern Afghanistan are really beautiful. The Hindu Kush and basically a long extension of the Himalayas. So
mm,
I would love to go back to Afghanistan if it was peaceful.
yeah, yeah. Okay, last question. If you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing, what would it be and why?
Oh, if I could bring peace to the Middle East, I would do that because I think it would be a great place to start, and because people seem to have been fighting there for 5 or 6 thousand years, from what I can
Forever.
tell.
Yeah.
So if one could bring peace for everybody in the Middle East, maybe that would spark change all over the world. But I don't think I've got that magic wand.
Well, I know, but it would be nice, and I think everyone would appreciate your gesture. So, all right. Well, hold on. Let me grab the book here because I want to get the full title of this awesome book. So, Tasting the Past is the book, The Science of Flavor and the Search for the Origins of Wine. Kevin Begos, it has been a pleasure speaking with you. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
John, it's been great talking to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.